I have developed an entirely new obsession. Hello and welcome to the Lechuga channel, where I like talking about literature among other things. I've been a pretty avid reader for the past 2.5 years of my life, but through all of that time there's always been one franchise that people always tell me to read, but I just keep resisting it, and that is of course Harry Potter. I resisted reading Harry Potter for so long because it's such a popular mainstream stuff that it doesn't really seem something like I'd be super into. I knew I'd read it eventually, I know I'd be into it probably, but I just didn't feel like reading it. However, that all changed when I actually went to London and saw the 3 and 4/4 station by in person, and I really wanted to see if I could slam myself against the wall to see if I could get to Hogwarts, but sadly there was a line to do exactly that, so I had to skip on it. But what I was able to do was go to the Harry Potter store that was right next to this station, and I bought this big collection that has all 7 books, and I figured that, hell, hey, might as well. I have all 7 there. If I want to read them, then they're there. If they're not, then, cool. But of course, I ended up saying, you know what, I'll read the first book. It's pretty short. I'll just see how it is. And well, I'm a little obsessed now. It's been a bit of a problem. So I figured what better way than to celebrate my obsession with this franchise that I always thought it would never be for me than by talking about the first 4 books, which are the ones I have read so far. No, I haven't read Order of the Phoenix, Half-Blood Prince, or Deathly Hallows yet. Please don't spoil them for me. But I just want to talk about the first 4 books in the series and just give my thoughts on it, my opinions, and hopefully if you've already read the Harry Potter books or maybe you watched the movies, you can re-experience them with me. Okay, so if you're already a Harry Potter fan, then you already know the story. J.K. Rowling's sitting in a train or whatever, and then she just has this idea, it's oh hey, what if I make this magical school with magical kids, and then there's one kid, it's the chosen one. It's holy shit! This initial inspiration is what led to the creation of the very first Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which was published in London in 1997. The first couple chapters I think are really great. The first chapter is dedicated almost entirely to the Dursleys and their normal life. There's lots of descriptions of them just being the Dursleys are super normal. They don't have anything weird happening in their life, and there's nothing weird or magical happening, because that would be insane. It gives you the perfect idea of what the Dursleys are, which are these really rich, generic, almost American Dream-esque characters, even though they live in London. But then you get introduced to Albus Dumbledore, who starts to explain all about the magical world, and his conversation with Professor McGonagall, it just kind of serves there to slightly contextualize what this is like, and obviously introduce the character of Harry Potter. I really like this because it very heavily emphasizes the important parts of the beginning of the book, which is the contrast between the normal London world and the fictional magical world of not only Hogwarts but just the wizarding world in general. It gives you a very good idea of what the whole story is going to be right off the bat, and also introduces lots of key characters like Albus Dumbledore and Hagrid and Professor McGonagall and of course Harry. Harry Potter is a character that's so easy to root for in these few opening chapters. He gets bullied by Dursley, he gets bullied by his uncle, he gets bullied by Aunt Petunia. Immediately, he's an extremely relatable character. You feel for him, you understand his perspective in wanting to get out of this house, maybe see something more in the world, but being powerless to do so. J.K. Rowling very cleverly shows enough of his misery without ever being overbearing to the reader of seeing this kid suffer in this house. It always kind of stays comical, like when Dursley is at the zoo and there's this snake and he's with his other friends kind of bullying Harry, and then Harry starts talking to the snake. Moments like these kind of balance the misery with just a little bit of hope and wackiness to make the situation as a whole not be too gloomy and too dark, and just enough for the reader to get the idea that Harry Potter is somebody you want to root for, somebody you like, and that you just want to see what happened. You want to see this kid get out of here. I particularly like the amount of narration J.K. Rowling uses, which is present throughout all of the books. This book uses a lot more, just a little more narration than I often see in books, specifically kids' books. You get a lot of details on Harry's psyche, what he's thinking, what he thinks of his uncle, what he thinks of his aunt, what he thinks of his cousin. it gives you more of an idea of what he's like down on the inside in his head, which makes it even easier to relate to him. It makes you want to root for him more, because you really feel like you know this kid after just 100 or so pages of him being miserable but having little tidbits of hope here and there. That's when we get the most awesome scene in the book, or at least this first one. Hagrid just like busts down the door and he just like walks up to Harry and he's like, "Harry, you're a wizard." And then Harry's all like, "What? I'm a wizard?" And then Harry's like, "Yes, Harry, you are a wizard." But I'm just Harry." "Well, just Harry, you are a wizard." "But Hagrid, I'm not a fucking wizard." This scene of Harry speaking to Hagrid at the beginning of the book is just perfect for the themes of it so far. After being completely hopeless, after feeling like he has nothing left in life, here comes this person that finally gives him the hope he needs to keep moving forward and to kind of give him something more in life. After 150 pages of misery, we finally get that hope, that feeling like you finally made it out of it. And that is, of course, with the wizarding world of Hogwarts. Now, I've read my fair share of books with magic and just kind of like these magical systems, and often they don't really feel like super fun or great because they're kind of generic. But what I love about the introduction and the world itself of the wizarding world is just the amount of like details and specific. When Harry walks into Diagon Alley, you get all of these details of what the world is like. He sees the broom, and the broom says it's the Nimbus 2000, so it's not just any broom. When Harry gives him his school supplies, we get a whole list of what said school supplies are, including books on fantastic beasts, books on the history of Quidditch. When Harry walks into the wand shop, he gets told by a shopkeeper what each wand is made out of and what they do. All of these details serve to make a world that's just so rich and believable. The details used to describe the world building, I think, is part of not only what makes this book great, but the Harry Potter franchise as a whole. Because seeing all of these things makes you want to go out and take out a wand and yell Expelliarmus to whoever shows up in front of you. And this scene in Diagon Alley perfectly introduces the reader to all of these concepts. It also introduces you to one of the, I wouldn't say cool antagonists, but kind of like the dipshit of the Harry Potter universe, and that is Draco Malfoy. Because you see, the wizarding world doesn't just have all of these details that make it feel realistic, but we also have a lot of just human bullshit. Draco Malfoy perfectly introduces all of like the dark side of the wizarding world. He talks about how some of the houses in Hogwarts are really bad, how mudbloods shouldn't belong in the wizarding world. He's kind of racist. It shows that the wizarding world is not just all sunshines and rainbows, but there is a genuine kind of like dark side to it. Well, not dark side, but more of like human nature side to it, which is more akin to the real world, which makes this world just even more believable and also creates an antagonist that's the perfect antithesis to Harry Potter. Now, Hogwarts is when the story properly kind of goes into full force, and we get a lot of what makes Harry Potter Harry Potter. So my personal favorite part of this section is the main trio of Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Yes, the world is great. Yes, it's super believable, but you can't really, world isn't everything, and character is super important in storytelling. When Harry meets Ron, it feels very genuine. Their conversation is, very charming. You really start to, Ron is a very lovable character, and, you just believe the relationship between the two. The two feel like they belong. They really feel like they're best friends, even though they just met. And then Hermione is the perfect character to kind of disrupt all of that. She's more nerdy, kind of chaotic. She's very book smart, which directly contrasts Harry and Ron. And I thought the three of them just work so well with each other. Combine these three lovable characters and this rich world of Hogwarts, and it makes you, the reader, feel like you're living almost like a dream life of sorts. You have these awesome friends, you have these awesome classes with cool spells, you have this Hogwarts built, castle with so many mysteries and secrets to find. It's very magical, has a lot of adventure to it, and it just made me want to go to Hogwarts. There's a lot of subplots during the Hogwarts section, like the Quidditch matches, which are really fun. There's the aforementioned Professor Snape, and the Philosopher's Stone, among a few of other things that happen throughout Hogwarts, which kind of build the formula that is Harry Potter. You have the main plot when it comes to the problem in Hogwarts, which then has a bunch of subplots in the middle and ends with the end of the plot itself. The subplots, I think, are pretty good. They're pretty passable for the story. They're not really meant to be anything like super wow or anything. They're meant to characterize the world more, make the characters more lovable, and I think they definitely did the job of doing that. The main plot is also pretty interesting, but this is when the parts of Harry Potter really start to feel like a kid's book, if you know what I mean. We have this MacGuffin that we need to find before the bad guy does it. There's not a lot of depth to it, and there doesn't need to be, but it does feel a little childish, which is, again, there's nothing wrong with that. And of course, then we have the climax of the story with Harry, Ron, and Hermione sneaking off to get into the actual room with the Philosopher's Stone, which is very plot-like, I guess. This to me is kind of like the weakest part of the book. It's still good, but in comparison to the time we spent with Ron, Hermione, and Harry, and also the time we spent with the Dursleys and the introduction of the magical world, to now all of a sudden to have these very kind of like defined games, like, oh, we have a chess game, and oh, there's a potions game, and then, oh, we have to face Professor Quirrell at the end. It did the job, but I think, I don't know, I wanted something a little more climactic, I guess. So Harry faces off against Professor Quirrell. It's kind of like a quick back and forth. There's nothing really super special happening, but overall, it was a pretty interesting climax. I think it did the job pretty well, even if now with the context of the other books, I think the other books did it a lot better. All of this leads to the ending where Gryffindor House wins for the first time in years, and it's a pretty satisfying conclusion. Overall, I'd say the Philosopher's Stone is so great mainly because of the world and characters. My favorite part is the main trio, like I said, of Harry, Ron, and Hermione, their relationship with each other, the feeling like you're in this house of Hogwarts and like you really are making all of these spells and following this magical world. Immersion is a big thing in the book, and I think that's just part of the reason why I found it so compelling. Now, after spending just 1 year in Hogwarts, of course I was itching to jump back in to reach the same levels of immersion as with the narration and the characters as was in the first book. So this led me to immediately picking up Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Well, Chamber of Secrets kind of follows the same formula of the first book, kind of. We start in the Dursley situation isn't great, Harry Potter is still being bullied, but then we cut to Hogwarts and we have a very similar plot there, which then leads to a big climax, and everything follows a similar formula, which I think is part of the reason why Chamber of Secrets might be my least favorite of the 4 I've read so far, because it doesn't really do anything like super unique or new, or it does introduce some new ideas, don't get me wrong, but in comparison to the other ones, it feels a little formulaic. So Harry Potter is still with the Dursleys, everything's kind of the same as it was in the first book, but eventually he finds himself with the Weasleys, which I think is really cool because we get to learn more about Ron's family. These characters are all really lovable, and Ron's family in general is just one of the cooler parts of the book, I think. Then there's a really funny scene of Harry and Ron actually slamming themselves against the wall in 9 3/4, only to, face a brick wall, which leads them to steal the car of all things and then fly it through the train and then make it to Hogwarts, and they crash land, which is all pretty funny. But to me, it's just kind of an attempt at trying to make a cool introduction to Hogwarts again, which it follows the same formula as the first book. And while there's nothing wrong with that, I guess I wanted something more unique to happen in this book instead of just almost like a near repetition of the first one. But then we finally reach Hogwarts and what is again my favorite part of the book, which is the relationship between the main trio of characters and the world, the immersion that comes from the narration that J.K. Rowling gives us of really everything from Harry's inner thoughts to Hogwarts itself. This time, the main plot of the story is much more interesting than the one in the first book, because people are being murdered. There's a genuine mystery going on in Hogwarts as people randomly get turned to stone after they're left unattended for a brief period of time. There's somebody out there opening the Chamber of Secrets, but we don't know who. While I dislike the general reusing of the formula from the first book, I will admit that the plot in Chamber of Secrets is so much better. The first book was just kind of a generic MacGuffin that they had to get, but this time we get an actual mystery that needs to be solved. There's lots of little tidbits being introduced, from characters being turned to stone, from Harry Potter being able to speak parcel tongue, which means he can speak snake, and overall it's just a conflict that very naturally kind of rises and progresses as it goes on. There's a genuine tension in the book, which there wasn't in Philosopher's Stone, if you ask me. Especially as more and more people turn to stone, and eventually Hermione gets turned to stone in a moment that really makes you want to find whoever's doing this and finally stop them. All of the subplots introduced in this book also add to the tension created by the plot. We get the introduction of Tom Riddle, which I thought was really cool. He's kind of he's super mysterious. He has more to not only the mystery of Hogwarts, but also more mystery to, who he is and what his role in all of this is. And so everything keeps going, keeps rising and rising and rising until we eventually get the climax in the Chamber of Secret itself, which I think is miles better than it was in Philosopher's Stone. Ron is left behind by a rebel, Professor Lockhart is being a little bitch, and Harry by himself has to face Tom Riddle, who is of course revealed to be Lord Voldemort, who's been manipulating Genie of all people to open the Chamber of Secrets and kill people. Well, not kill them, but turn them to stone. I thought this reveal was very well done. I really like the fact that Tom Riddle is Voldemort, because it kind of indirectly gives you a backstory on the character without you knowing it's him, so that way you have a better understanding of Voldemort in the upcoming books when he actually shows up. And having Genie be the one to open the Chamber of Secrets is kind of it's almost a little heartwarming, because you didn't expect somebody so innocent to be doing all of this and doing them unintentionally. And the climax itself with the giant snake and Harry taking out the sword from the hat and being like, holy shit, I'm Gryffindor, and then he cuts the snake in half and there's poison in his arm. It's a really exciting climax that perfectly brings the plot together in a way that's satisfying. Tom Riddle is gone, but he'll show up again. It's a really neat conclusion. However, my main criticism with the book as a whole is that, again, it's a little formulaic. You start with the Dursleys, then you have Hogwarts, then you have a plot where we need to find a place, and then you have subplots that coincide with the plot, which all leads to one big climax where Gryffindor wins the tournament at the end. Yes, I think it's overall done better than it was done in the first book, but the lack of new structure or new concepts introduced in the storytelling I thought was a little off-putting. It's still a great book, don't get me wrong, but I guess I wanted to see something more fresh be introduced into the Harry Potter formula, and I was getting a little worried thinking that every Harry Potter book was just going to be the same formula again, but boy was I wrong. Now, even though I was a little more critical of Chamber of Secrets since it was a bit more formulaic, I was still more than excited to get into my third year in Hogwarts with Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Now, before hopping into this one, I already knew that this was kind of a fan favorite among, Harry Potter enthusiasts, so I was more than excited to hop into it and see how J.K. Rowling reimagines the world of Harry Potter a third time. And in all honesty, even though this one also somewhat follows the formula of the first two books, this one, in my opinion, perfects this formula. So already in the beginning, we get the scene with the Dursleys as we have in the previous two books, but now it's a little more somber than it was in the first one, because Harry Potter really wants to go to Hogsmeade, which is where all of his friends will be, so he makes this deal with his uncle that if he's nice to Aunt March, then he'll let him do so, but, he gets even more ravishly bullied, he gets more, shit on for this first section of the book, even more so than he was in Philosopher's Stone. And this eventually causes him to break and he blows up Aunt Marge, which was honestly pretty hilarious. This puts Harry Potter in an even lower state than he was in any of the previous books, or at least in these first few sections. He runs away from home, he doesn't have anybody. It puts him in a new low that we haven't seen in any of the previous books before, which creates deeper empathy for the character and, makes you want to see him rise up again. We've seen him be at the top of his game in Hogwarts, but now he's been brought down a little bit more. But then he gets taken to Hogwarts and the proper plot of the story starts after that low. However, one of the things that I really love about the book is the plot itself, because it's completely different to what we've gotten before. Here, we have the introduction of an entirely new antagonist in the form of Sirius Black. There's a lot of talk and rumors of Sirius Black throughout the first few sections of the book. You get told that he killed a bunch of people a bunch of years ago. You get told that he's ruthless and he worked for Voldemort. And most importantly, he's escaped from Azkaban and is on the run. All of these descriptions of the character really paint this picture of somebody who's really not someone you want to mess with. He was Voldemort's right-hand man almost, and having an antagonist like this actually be on the loose creates another sense of tension, but also creates an entirely different conflict to the one we've seen in the previous two books. And on top of this, we also learned that Sirius Black was indirectly responsible for the death of Harry's parents, which, not only is he ruthless, but he's also a perfect antagonist because his relationship to the main character Harry Potter is much more personal, which makes the actual, conflict between protagonist and antagonist much more emotional and meaningful than we have gotten in any of the previous books. Sirius Black, alongside the slightly more somber nature, is at the core of what makes the conflict of Prisoner of Azkaban so much more compelling than the other ones. But then we have another introduction that adds to this, which is the Dementors. These things scared the shit out of me when I was a kid, and they scare the shit out of me more now than ever, now that I fully understand what they are. The Dementors are like these beings that suck out all happiness and sense of joy out of you, and they are in Hogwarts to try and prevent Sirius Black from getting there, because of course, he's after Harry. The Dementors work more as antagonists than actual protectors of Hogwarts, and their presence give an entirely new, kind of like atmosphere and vibe to Hogwarts that again hasn't been present in the other books, and it drives home the point that Prisoner of Azkaban is a book that's very different from the first two. So we also get the subplots in this book, and I think the subplots are some of my favorites. First off, we get the Professor Lupin's class, which ends up being really important. There's a scene near the beginning where he takes out this monster which turns into whoever's looking at its worst fear, and he takes each of the students and makes them say ridiculous, and then the monster turns into all of these like goofy things. It feels like the world is expanding in this scene, because Chamber of Secrets, while interesting, didn't really give us more of the wizarding world, but in scenes like this in Prisoner of Azkaban really make you feel like the wizarding world goes beyond Hogwarts with the introduction of these monsters and these new spells. But then we get another important detail, which is when Lupin specifically chooses not to have Harry be the one to do the same thing as everybody else. And it's explained later on that the reason he did this was because of a fear that the monster would turn into Lord Voldemort, which makes perfect sense and later on leads to an entirely different subplot where Harry practices his Expecto Patronum spell to try and fight against the Dementors. And that's another part I love about Prisoner of Azkaban. Harry Potter as a character is a little different in his mind frame. He's a bit more hateful, if you will. Because of Sirius Black and because of his fear of the Dementors, he gets bullied more by Draco, he gets bullied more by Snape, and he's a lot more spiteful, he has a lot more hatred in his heart, and part of the plot of this story is not only fighting these villains, but also dealing with those emotions and kind of like moving past them. And I think that's just superb character writing. I really love getting all of these narrations on Harry Potter and how he's feeling and how he's like dealing with all of those emotions. And there's a scene when he's with the Dementors, the monster turns into the Dementor, and then the Dementor kind of like consumes him, and he starts seeing the world of like before his parents died. He hears his parents' voice, which kind of fills him with even deeper hatred. He's a super empathetic character who you really feel for, and you feel like you really get him. It's almost like you are him with the way the emotions are described, and I think that's just such great character writing. All of this culminates in a climax that I just think is superb, where everything comes together in a very satisfying conclusion. Harry, Ron, and Hermione are cornered by Sirius Black, and then Professor Lupin shows up to try and save them, and then we get this kind of like the only weak part of the climax, where it's like this exposition, them explaining to them not only who Sirius Black is, but also his relationship to Harry Potter's dad and his history, and that in reality the real villain is the rat. I don't actually remember his name. So as it turns out, Ron's rat, I think it's called a familiar, where he carries around with him. He's actually like a guy. Like, he's just a person. And so in the middle of the scene, Lupin turns the rat into the guy who used to be friends with Sirius and Lupin, and they try and kill him, but Harry Potter, having moved past all of his hatred and realizing that Sirius Black isn't actually that bad of a guy, decides to defend them in ways that protagonists like this should. Now, like I said, this is kind of like the weaker part of the climax because it's just a lot of exposition, but it leads to the coolest climax we've gotten in Harry Potter so far. So around this time, we'd also get the reveal that Lupin is a werewolf, and when they're leaving with the rat in their hands, he sees the full moon, and as werewolves do, they wolf out, which causes the group to not only get separated, but also the Dementors to find Sirius Black. And now that Harry, he learns more about Sirius. He learned more about Sirius Black. He knows he's his godfather, that he actually cares about Harry. So after moving past all of his hatred, he finds a new love for Sirius Black, and in an ironic twist, he wants to defend him. But of course, he can't, and the Dementors almost get him if it weren't for the fact that somebody used Expecto Patronum to stop them. Then everything seems like it's lost until Hermione reveals that she has a goddamn time-traveling watch, that the two used to go back in time a few hours and change a few events, which, by the way, the clock was perfectly foreshadowed by all of the instances of descriptions of Hermione seemingly being able to take 2 classes at once, and that's because she literally was taking 2 classes at once. All of the subplots, including Buckbeak and even the Quidditch matches, come together in this cool climax where Harry helps Sirius. He ends up being the one that uses Expecto Patronum to fend off the Dementors in just a perfect moment where all of his training with Lupin pays off. He moves past his hatred in a conclusion that feels very satisfying and perfectly brings everything together. Prisoner of Azkaban is, in my eyes, the perfect Harry Potter book when it comes to the formula we've gotten so far. The plot is super interesting. There's lots of great character writing with Harry Potter and his other and the other characters as well. The subplots perfectly come together into the main plot to create a story that feels very satisfying, has a lot of cool twists and turns all throughout the thing, and it's just the near perfect book so far. If this was a trilogy, this would be by far the best one. And now finally, after all of my rambling, we get to the 4th book I'll be talking about for this video, and that is none other than Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. So after reading Prisoner of Azkaban, I was thinking like, well, okay, you already perfected the formula with the 3rd book. How are you gonna make this 4th one better than that? And well, you don't. Instead of relying on the same formula used in the past 3 books, what Goblet of Fire does is that it invents an entirely new formula for Harry Potter and does something entirely new and different by taking the previous world and just making ever so slightly more mature. In this book, we see Harry Potter dealing with conflicts that can't be solved by just aiming his wand at something and yelling Expecto Patronum. Now he deals with conflicts that are a bit more nuanced, a bit more personal, things we haven't really gotten in these books previously, except ever so slightly in Prisoner of Azkaban. Goblet of Fire starts out and things are already noticeably different. Harry Potter is much more cocky, he's much more confident in himself, which is in direct contrast of how he was in the previous 3 books, and this is mainly due to the fact that he now knows he has a godfather who's also a serial killer. He kind of uses this as a way to keep the Dursleys in check and keep himself in like a very comfortable space, and I think this works very well because we see Harry Potter in all these dire situations, and for once in this book we see him being kind of like in a cool place. He's all nice and tuckered up, he's not suffering anymore, and I think this works pretty well for a book that's the 4th in a franchise, and it'd be pretty dull if we just repeated the same things. This then leads to the big Quidditch World Cup, which again, similar to Prisoner of Azkaban, expands the world of the Wizarding World further than we've seen in any of the previous books. It's not just Hogwarts anymore. Now there's this entire universe of wizards. There's lots of adult wizards. There's the Quidditch tournament that's super high stakes. There's lots of people in it. We get the introductions of lots of key characters such as Victor Krum and Cedric, which are going to become important for later on in the story. This part with Quidditch does a perfect job of expanding the world and characters in a way we haven't seen before, but also making it a lot darker, because this is when we get the black sign thing in the sky, which foreshadows that somebody from Voldemort's squad is back, the Death Eaters. The actual menace of Voldemort has been pretty tame throughout the past 3 books, but in this section in the beginning, we get told that, hey, shit just got real. Voldemort is possibly coming back because his supporters are finally taking action, and that sense of, kind of like this dark undertone and the big universe makes you feel like you're not really a kid anymore, you're growing up, which makes perfect sense. And Harry Potter is 14 now, so of course he's going to deal with slightly more mature conflicts that deal more with the real world. But then, of course, after a long section in the Quidditch tournament, we finally get back to Hogwarts and what is the main conflict of Goblet of Fire, and that is the Triwizard Tournament. A bunch of schools outside of Hogwarts come into the place to participate in this tournament, where anybody who's over the age of 17 can put their name in the Goblet of Fire, and they're chosen. They have to participate in some life or death shit to win the tournament for their school name and a lot of money. There's this very clear setup of what the Triwizard Tournament is and what the Goblet of Fire is as well. You really get the sense by Dumbledore's speeches and also the descriptions that this is really not something that anybody wants to mess with. This is like a big thing. You could possibly die. People have died before. They haven't done this in years, which of course leads to the reveal that a 4th champion was chosen. And I remember when I was reading that, I was like, holy shit. I thought that was just a clever twist, because Harry Potter doesn't want to be in the tournament, nor should he be, because again, it's some life or death shit. The Triwizard Tournament again works as the main conflict of the story, but yeah, you could say it's just a bunch of tasks that he needs to solve, but there's a lot more going on. The tasks themselves are like the smaller part of the story. The bigger part is the actual role of Harry Potter in the Triwizard Tournament, because even though he didn't put his name in the Goblet of Fire, everybody thinks he put his name in the Goblet of Fire. And this creates a lot of distress in the character. It creates a conflict between him and Ron, where Ron thinks he actually did put his name in it, and he's kind of jealous because he keeps getting all the attention. And so this creates a fracture in their friendship that we haven't seen before. It's again part of the slightly more mature problems that I was mentioning earlier that Harry Potter has to face and deal with. He kind of lost his friend for a moment there and needs to find a way to grieve with that pain and manage his emotions to eventually have the maturity to kind of, be able to reconcile with Ron. And then, of course, there's the Triwizard Tournament itself, where he has to plan out everything, try and figure out what he's going to do, what the task is even going to be. And he has to do all of this while being bullied by Draco and Snape and losing his friend, and the discourse that comes from it really affects him. This serves as the main plot of the story, and the subplots are superb as always. My favorite part is, of course, Alastor Moody as the new professor of Defense League against Dark Arts. He's such a fascinating character who, again, further introduces the darker and more real, kind of like real aspects of the wizarding world by introducing the kind of like illegal spells, like the Imperio and Avada Kedavra spells, which can manipulate somebody and kill them respectively. He serves a major part in the book, and he feels like, an ally but not really of Harry Potter, which makes him a wild card in this story. And I always thought he was one of the most interesting parts whenever he was on screen, or on book, I guess. After the first task, Harry Potter is like, everything's much better, he's a lot happier, and the lead up to the second task isn't as tenseful, or even, I'd say, as kind of like emotional as it is the first time around, but we still get a lot of great moments with his relationship with Ron and Hermione, and then Alastor Moody and whatnot. And then the second task comes around and it's super tense. There's underwater. The descriptions make you really feel like the pressure of the water and the gills and the oxygen. It's all really immersive, which is kind of what I love about this book. And the more these tasks go on, the more we get development on the world and Harry himself, but we also get a lot of development on the other champions such as Victor Crumb and Cedric. At first, Harry doesn't really like them, especially Cedric, because he got Cho Chang to go with him, and Harry kind of liked Cho Chang, which has also been foreshadowed in the other books. But the more the book goes on, the more he builds a bit of a friendship between Cedric, and he actually ended up being one of my favorite characters all the way leading up until the end. end. By the end of the book, when he gets to the final task, Harry Potter is finally riled up. He's ready to win it. He had all these doubts and worries before, but he's like, you know what, screw it, I can do this. I can beat the tournament. I ain't no bitch ass. And alongside his friendship with Cedric, he eventually does make it to the cup, touches it, and, well, if you read the book, you know what happens. It's revealed that the entire tournament was completely rigged and Harry was going to win no matter what. Cedric gets killed off by Voldemort, who's now revived, and Harry isn't in the greatest circumstances. It feels like Harry's in the most dire circumstances in this climax, like he's, gonna get screwed against Voldemort at any moment, but, he kind of gets riled up and it's like, I'm not gonna die, a little bitch, I'm gonna fight back. He uses Expelliarmus spell against Voldemort in a super tense and perfect climax to this book. I got a little emotional when all of Voldemort's past victims start coming out of his wand. It kind of gives Harry that hope he needs, that hope that's really necessary in a climax like this. And eventually he's able to survive and take Cedric's body with him. The rest of the book is really somber and melancholic, especially with Cedric's death being like a huge blow. I almost fucking cried when the description said that Cedric is dead. I was like, no, there's no way. He's fine, he's gonna come back. But no, it's in this section that it's confirmed that he's fully dead, and everything is left just a little more somber for a slightly more mature Harry Potter, which will hopefully continue in Order of the Phoenix. Now, before I wrap up this video, I do want to give like a brief tier list of all my Harry Potter books so far. Starting with Philosopher's Stone, this is it's the first one. It perfectly introduces the world. It has great characters. The main conflict is a little to be desired, but overall, I say this is an A-tier book. Chamber of Secrets. It repeated the formula in ways that I don't really, I don't really like on a storytelling perspective, but the plot is great, and I think it overall did a better job of the exact same formula as Philosopher's Stone, even if it didn't feel for real original from a storytelling standpoint. But I'll put it in the A tier as well. Prisoner of Azkaban, like I said, took the formula from the previous two books and essentially perfected it in a way that's satisfying, with a conflict that's a little more nuanced and gives us a more depth into the character of Harry Potter and the world. This is an easy S tier. And lastly, Goblet of Fire took the Harry Potter world and formula, made it ever so slightly more mature, and created a world and narrative that's so impactful, so emotionally driven. I'm gonna have to crank out the God tier for this one. This is just that good. I'll likely be making a follow-up video once I actually finish reading the latter 3 Harry Potter books, so if you want to see me ramble more about literature, then make sure to subscribe to the LeChuga channel for weekly uploads. And hey, while you're at it, hit the like button as well. It really helps me out. What are your thoughts on the Harry Potter books? Have you read the books? Have you seen the movies? Regardless of anything, let me know in the comments below. I like talking about, storytelling and literature and everything related to fiction in this channel. So if any of that sounds nice to you, make sure to hit the bell to be notified of new videos. And hey, if you like this video, why not watch another one? I have a playlist on screen with all my literary related videos right now. Well, that's gonna be about it. See ya.